Magic, or what historians called commonly magic, was very much alive, of course, in the Middle Ages, and it remained a major topic of intellectual debate also in the Renaissance. In fact, if anything, magic became more important within learned discourse, especially with the impetus, the impulse, the influx of Hermetic and Neoplatonic ideas, for example, with Marsilio Ficino and Di Vita, with the third book. Let's see whether that works. That was basically devoted to how to attract the supernatural forces from heavens or from the skies. The Protestant Reformation had its share as well, though it focused more on the dangers of magic and witchcraft. Luther, for example, gave a prominent place to the workings of the devil, attributing even his own diseases to diabolical influences. Melanchthon called for a detailed understanding of how precisely the devil could take advantage of the physiological and pathological processes in the body, in particular by manipulating the animal spirits and creating delusions to achieve his evil ends. Wittenberg physicians like Caspar Peuzer and Tobias Tandler embarked on learned analyses of incantations, ecstasy, that is when the soul leaves the body, incubus, and similar phenomena. And Johannes Virus and Ovaya and Thomas Erastus famously discussed the powers of witches and insisted on their limits. This learned discourse on magic and witchcraft provides the background of my paper today, but it is not my topic. I will not look at intellectual debates, but I will look at the place of magical beliefs and practices in ordinary medical practice. That is, I'm interested in the ways in which more or less ordinary practicing academic physicians perceived the various magic beliefs and practices they encountered among their patients or among the population at large, among the folks around them, and how they dealt with them. Did they reject them as mere superstition, as we would be inclined to think when we read all these harsh criticisms of the superstition and the ignorance of the vulgus in general and of the muliarculae, the wise women or women folks in particular? Or did they take them seriously or indeed adapt them? And if so, for what reasons? In order to approach these issues, I will not rely on learned treatises then, but on a body of sources on which I've worked for quite some years now, namely on more than 4,000 pages of personal notes, mostly Latin, that a little-known Bohemian German-speaking physician by the name of Georg Hansch assembled from his youth in the late 1540s until his death in 1578. Hansch, the name is spelled like hand with an SCH at the end, or Hantius in Latin, had enjoyed an excellent humanist education and is also known as a poet. But eventually he studied medicine in Padua in the 1550s, and on his return to Prague, he moved in a circle of physicians that included Ulrich and Adam Lehner, the Habsburg court physicians, Andrea Gallo and Pietro Andrea Mattioli, Johannes Willenbruch, and others. He saw patients with them, sometimes treated patients of his own, but never established a successful practice of his own. Eventually, probably around 1568, he was appointed as one of the personal physicians of the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand II and moved to Innsbruck in Tyrol, so he also got to learn popular culture in that area. It was not a particularly lucrative or prestigious position. The court was small, and Hans' colleague Willenbruch compared the position quite bluntly to slavery. In other words, Hansch was a rather insignificant figure who made no major contributions to the history of medicine. But as I have tried to show in a recent book, maybe a brief moment of PR is allowed, his notes are extremely valuable in many respects when we want to understand the everyday world, the everyday practice of academic physicians in the German lands. And as you will see, they also offer quite unique insights into popular medical beliefs and practices. By the way, an English edition is on its way. So there are many dozens of passages on popular magical beliefs and practices in Hansch's notebooks, some very short, others more elaborate. Some of them refer to specific cases of illness which the patients or their relatives attributed to magic or witchcraft. For example, an old man who suffered from a burning sensation when making water believed it was the result of a maleficium of a neighbor. Hansch saw, together with Mattioli, a countryman of about 50 years who had suffered a strange kind of seizure for years, again and again, almost every month. He then ate nothing for days, stood motionless and wordless, leaning against the wall until he collapsed unconscious. During the seizure, he said it was as if a wild animal were lying on him, but he could not move and was kicking his feet in the greatest fear. The sick man suspected that it was an inflicted ailment, a maleficium. His father's mistress, he told the physicians, had once caused his mother a maleficium, and he feared that it had passed on to him. When another young man in the service of the court was seized by madness, people believed he had been bewitched, maleficiatum, by a certain woman. Several entries in Hansch's notebooks refer to love magic, that is, using magical means to win a lover or to take revenge when love was rejected or betrayed. Apparently, the rituals used for this purpose were quite widely known among ordinary folks, and it was generally accepted that they worked. People said, for example, that a man became impotent, as Hansch heard, if a needle was sewn into his clothing that had served to sew a corpse into cloth before. Apparently, and that is striking, patients did not hesitate to offer this kind of explanation to the learned physicians. A man of the church, a dean, for example, who consulted Hansch and his colleagues because of his sexual impotence, believed himself bewitched by a maid. A noblewoman sought Willenbroch's and Mattioli's help because she had not been able to sleep for 8 days and was trembling, and believed that was a maleficium. Another noble patient, the Lady of Hungerkasten, suspected that her husband's mistress might have bewitched her and was the true reason for her severe headaches and many other ailments. Hansch clearly had doubts, but at the same time he was prepared to take advantage of such beliefs. In chronic diseases, and especially with female patients, he noted, he could see whether they had enemies, and in that case, when his treatment was unsuccessful, he could take refuge to this explanation and attribute the disease to a maleficium, even though, admittedly, that was somewhat at odds with a rational approach. What clearly interested and convinced these physicians much more than the possible magical causation of diseases, however, were the different types of magical sympathetic healing that were known and practiced among ordinary folks. Hansch noted a wide range of them. Just to give a couple of examples, people said that if someone had been bitten by a rabid dog, it was necessary to put the hair of the dog into the wound. He heard from a captain that wounds caused by a knife, a sword, or a nail would not fester if the weapon or nail in question was then plunged into a piece of bacon. A patient showed him an amulet that had freed him from impotence. Hansch's own stepmother told him that people called hypericum Our Lady's root because it protected women in childbed against maleficia. And Hansch also considered noteworthy that a teacher in the service of the court told him that wood from the gallows possessed curative powers when its application was accompanied by pious prayers. And Hansch not only documented these popular practices, he also repeatedly reported cases in which magical sympathetic procedures, for all he knew, had actually worked. The pepper, for example, which grew on the grave of a certain Jaroslav of Bernstein, was given to all fever patients in the village, and all of them were freed of their fever. He also described how his own 4-year-old niece fell seriously ill with a fever. She coughed, vomited, and had severe nosebleed. At that point, a certain Martha, presumably a maid, tied long red strings around her knees, elbows, wrists, and several other joints. Apparently, the sympathetic effects of the color red and the tying were supposed to stop the flow of blood from the nose. The hope was fulfilled. The very next day, the child felt better, Hunch remarked. The nosebleeds did return briefly, but eventually stopped altogether. Hunch and at least some of the physicians around him even found popular magical healing practices noteworthy that relied almost exclusively on the power of words. A town clerk told him about a feverish woman who immediately recovered when someone put an amulet around her neck with a piece of paper inside that read, "I, Margaret, have the cold fever. May thunder, lightning, and infernal fire come into me, and it will soon cease." Against fever, one had to take 3 pieces of bread, he noted in another entry. On the first, one had to write Pax Pater and a cross and recite 3 Lord's Prayers and 3 Hail Marys. On the second, one had to write Amor, Amor Filius, with 2 crosses, pray 5 Lord's Prayers and 5 Hail Marys because of the 5 wounds of Christ. Finally, on the third piece, one had to write Virtus Spiritus Sancti and pray 7 Lord's Prayers and 7 Hail Marys because of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. It is not surprising, then, that the physicians in Hunch's circle were not fundamentally opposed to the use of amulets either, quite to the contrary. Hunch declared the classic formula Apagadabra, written on a piece of paper and hung around the neck as an amulet, to be an effective remedy against fever diseases. Interestingly, he did consider it prudent, however, not to reveal his beliefs to the patients and their relatives. In order for the doctor not to appear superstitious, he wrote, he should place the paper without the knowledge of the patient into an apple and hang that apple around his or her neck, the patient's neck. From his colleague Andrea Gallo, Hunch heard the story of a certain Dr. Hertwig, against whose persistent 4-day fever the doctors could do nothing. When an old woman finally advised him to use an amulet, the doctors expressly allowed it. On the following day, the fever was so severe that the patient wanted to throw the amulet away. But after that, the fever attack stopped. Andrea Gallo, on his part, a highly renowned physician at the Habsburg court, reported good experiences with another sympathetic healing method in a young woman who suffered from toothache. Hunch took very careful note of how Gallo proceeded. Clearly, he thought he might want to do the same himself. One had to write a tetragrammaton on a piece of paper, presumably the 4 letters in the Hebrew word for God, or the letters I-N-R-I, and one had to leave some space between the individual letters. Then one had to use a stone to drive a horseshoe nail through each letter until the letter where the pain subsided was reached. As long as the nail was left there, the pain would not come back. What are we to make of this? After all, as I mentioned, the medical literature of the time tended to be very hostile to the medical notions and practices of the common folks and of the popular healers in particular, and they routinely lambasted magical, sympathetic healing as superstitious. And as we just heard, Hunch himself thought it wise to hide from his patients that he actually was using an amulet to cure them. Such practices, then, it seems, had no place in learned physicians' public self-fashioning. Yet, in private, the physicians were not only interested in these practices, they actually believed they worked. Was it the influence of learned writers like Ficino, or later Giambattista della Porta? Possible, but I doubt it. Hunch took numerous notes, made excerpts from a wide range of authors, but none from learned writing on magic or incantations. The major reason for this remarkable openness for popular magical beliefs and practices lies elsewhere, it seems to me. It was, I would argue, only one aspect of a growing openness towards the medical beliefs and practices of ordinary folks in general. Physicians in the Renaissance went to great length to try and distinguish their medicine, to present themselves as practitioners of a very, very different type of medicine, a far superior type of medicine compared to the medicine of their competitors, the barber surgeons and the many popular healers. And they were quite successful in this endeavor. Many upper-class patients now routinely prefer their services. Ultimately, however, the professional and the economic success of a physician, and this physicians are very much aware of, depended crucially on his ability to successfully cure patients. When word went around that patients were doing well under the treatment of certain physicians, he could hope that other patients, especially patients from the higher ranks who would remunerate his services very well, would also seek his counsel. By contrast, when word went around that he often failed, there were lots of competitors at hand. So in this situation, physicians were well advised to take seriously trustworthy reports on any kind of medicine, herb, or popular medical practice that worked, and they did. In their publications, they rarely admitted it, but as Hunch's notebooks and then more occasionally other contemporary sources show, learned physicians were prepared to learn also from the experience of popular healers, even of the much despised old women when they heard that they had cured patients of a certain disease. Hunch repeatedly used the term "I learned," in Latin "didici," when he reported such knowledge. For example, he had learned from the empiricus, the empiric, in his native Libra, how to treat certain patients or how to produce certain medicines. In one case, Hunch even asked a pharmacist to help him identify a plant that a female healer had successfully used to treat a patient. Clearly, he hoped to use it on his own patients. So seen from this perspective, the fact that physicians like Hunch and his colleagues took popular magical beliefs and practices seriously was only one aspect of a much wider trend among practicing physicians, a growing and indeed dominant belief in the value of empirical observation, not only in the dissection room and in botany, but also, and indeed above all, in medical practice. Historians, admittedly, have maybe not paid as much attention to the rise of empirical approaches when it comes to medical practice, presumably because the results of these empirical researches did not stand the test of time. But physicians at the time very much hoped to improve their practice that way, their therapeutic outcomes that way. And even anatomy, I would argue, we could discuss that, was to a considerable degree a means to that end. So from this perspective, physicians interested in magical cures quite simply approached an empiricist approach to any kind of therapy, whether it was a well-established medicine like Hiera Prigra or Cassia, waters from the different thermal springs, newly discovered herbs or medicinal substances, or magical rituals. Because in all cases, the efficacy might not rest primarily on the primary qualities or the resulting secondary qualities of the specific herb, for example, as traditional pharmacology taught. It might reside in some hidden, occult power of virtue, which could only be identified and confirmed by empirical observation, as the lodestone or the torpedo fish, which sent out shocks, clearly showed there were effects in nature which worked without any direct physical contact, but the effects could be seen. So the force, this occult force, could only be assessed by empirical observation. So from this kind of attitude, I would argue, it was only a small step to acknowledging that medical practices and sympathetic rituals could work, in principle at least. At the same time, this empirical attitude went hand in hand, I should add, with a certain degree of skepticism. It was important to make sure that the seemingly proven remedy or charm really worked. Physicians like Hunch were familiar with Galen's warning that it was important to observe the curative effect of a given remedy not just once, but many times. And in his notes on proven experimenta, as successful remedies were commonly called at the time, Hansch frequently cross-referenced to previous entries on other patients who were given the same substance successfully, or even compiled lists of such patients. Assessing the curative virtues of magical rituals and amulets was not fundamentally different, except that this transpires from Hansch's notes certainly that the alleged curative powers of words, of charms, or prayers seem to have with somewhat more doubt on the part of the physicians. Without questioning that they worked in the individual case, physicians were aware of a possible alternative explanation for the success, basically what we would call placebo effect today. Thus, Andrea Gallo, who generally thought high of amulets, told Hansch the story of a girl with tertian fever. They put an amulet around her neck and the fever disappeared. Then, however, a man came, opened the amulet, found a slip of paper with a biblical verse on it, and threw it into the fire. Promptly, the fever came back. At this point, according to Gallo, the man consoled the girl and pretended to write the same verse on another piece of paper. In fact, he only wrote some nonsensical words, however. They put the amulet back on the girl's neck, and the fever went away again. Clearly, Hansch, as Gallo concluded, this was not due to the amulet and the power of the biblical verse inside. It was the girl's belief in its power which had worked. And with this, I want to conclude my paper. Admittedly, we do not have many sources on the ways in which Renaissance physicians perceived and dealt with popular magical beliefs and practices in their everyday practice. Hansch's notebooks are quite exceptional in this respect, but they do offer clear evidence that magical practices, like remedies that relied on occult forces, could have their legitimate place in the medical world and indeed in the everyday practice of learned physicians, not in spite of, but precisely because of the place empirical observation had acquired in academic medical practice long before, of course, the famous scientific revolution of the 17th century. Thank you.